Thank you for joining me. In this video, I'm going to tell you the remarkable story of how in the 1920s the U.S. Navy first created its aviation operations capability, and I will use the very first film and photo of these operations. But more than just a story of naval aviation and aircraft carrier creation, I'm going to show you the very first aircraft landing on a carrier and several of the first carrier landings as the U.S. Navy positioned a camera right on the deck to capture these flight landings to determine what was working and what wasn't. It's quite fascinating to watch close up these very first landings and mishaps. Dirigible advancement was an important component of aviation creation at this time because it was common thought that dirigibles would be the most common means of passenger travel because the human body would be unable to withstand the forces that airplanes would exert upon the body. But then, on May 6, 1937, in Manchester Township, New Jersey, United States, the LZ-129 Hindenburg caught fire. Dreams of dirigible transport ended. We learned from my video, The Day U.S. Navy Admirals Wept, that a huge turning point in military aviation capabilities came on July 21, 1921, when U.S. Army Air Services pilots under the command of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell sank an aircraft carrier which many outside of the Army aviation community believe could not be sunk by aerial bombing. From that point forward, both the Army and Navy committed significant resources to build their aviation capability, the Army Air Service initiating the air bombing effort with the new, rugged Martin MB-2 bomber. U.S. Navy Rear Admiral William Moffett became known as the Air Admiral for his leadership of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics from its creation in 1921. He was a master politician who believed the Navy must harness air power before the other services achieved this capability and a greater share of the defense budget. Moffett oversaw the development of naval aircraft operations and the early experimentation of seaplanes and airplane takeoffs from platforms built on top of ship turrets. In 1920, the Navy launched the USS Langley, CV-1. She was an experiment, a flight deck built upon an obsolete collier's hull, essentially a coal hauler. The Langley was an airport sent out to sea, as the Navy described it. Before we watch the carrier landings, I'm very briefly going to talk about another warfighting capability that was tried but discarded within a few years. Balloons were used during World War I as aerial observation posts and provided such an effective offensive capability. The German Krupp was designed to shoot down enemy balloons. The U.S. had balloon guns as well, 37 millimeter, and many of these were Navy ship mounted. The U.S. Army Air Service pilots who engaged these balloons to shoot them down were called balloon busters. I'm going to have a separate video on balloon operations because it was such a significant aspect of fighting in World War I, and I have original film. Navy Lieutenant Commander Chevalier made the first landing on the Langley deck in 1922. Now let's view these very first carrier landings. The Navy did not record any sound with this original film. Skills needing development included air navigation, gunfire spotting, and aerial gunnery. Catapult operations were tested and trained upon, and development of arresting gear, an elevator to clear the flight deck, safe fuel handling techniques, and landing light systems. This was truly the age of aviation experimentation, and all types of novelty were being tried at the time. The first helicopter prototypes were tested. The first parachute tests used dummies or mannequins. Aircraft design from 1925 to 1930 presented challenges. Aircraft and their engines were more powerful, bigger and faster, and planes heavier, creating strain on flight decks. As the range of planes increased, the Navy began to experiment with different types of bombing, to include submarine torpedoes and depth charges. The Navy was developing strategic doctrine as well, how the naval air forces should operate, to include the maneuvers a carrier fleet might use in war. In 1926, the Navy was refused a separate air arm as it had requested. The Navy continued to develop wartime tactics. Two new carriers joined the fleet in 1928, the Lexington CV-2 and Saratoga CV-3. Both were converted cruiser hulls. Both were improvements over the old Langley, but both were having to accommodate faster and heavier planes. Much of the early carrier doctrine was being developed from these operations. One of the new tactics developed was independent carrier strikes, apart from carrier operations supporting the battleship line. This tactic developed into a carrier-centered task force. Aircraft elevators, two each, were constructed for both the Saratoga and Lexington to accommodate larger amounts of aircraft. The officers and crew of the Saratoga were honored by the aviator Charles Lindbergh's visit aboard the Saratoga in the Pacific Ocean near the Panama Canal on February 8, 1929. Lindbergh stayed on board for 2 days. Lindbergh was the first person, of course, to cross the Atlantic in flight, flying from New York to Paris in 1927 in 63 hours. While he was on the Saratoga, he was invited to fly the new Boeing F-3B-1. Upon departure, Lindbergh flew off the deck himself in a Boeing F-3B-1. The squadron emblem of Felix the cat holding a spherical bomb is painted on side of the plane. A naval exercise, Fleet Problem 9, which took place in January 1929, was significant as it was the first exercise to test the concept of an independent carrier task force. Naval aviation was a rapidly evolving technology, and the fleet carriers used for the first time in this problem were an emerging capability. A simulated attack was conducted on the Panama Canal. The exercise demonstrated the great potential for independent carrier operations, but also exposed the significant vulnerabilities of the carrier task force.
The USS Ranger CV-4 was the first carrier built from the keel up as a carrier. But by the time she was commissioned, she was too small and her flight deck too short. Her arresting gear was unable to handle the faster and heavier planes still coming along. Not until Yorktown CV-5 was commissioned in 1937 did we get a third assault carrier to join Saratoga and Lexington. By this time, flight techniques and aircraft design had progressed enough to justify steady building. Enterprise, CV-6, and Wasp and Hornet, CV-7 and 8, were all commissioned before 1941. As these new carriers joined the fleet, we continued to sharpen the techniques and tactics involved in their use. During fleet maneuvers in 1938, Vice Admiral Ernest J. King foreshadowed the Japanese attack of 1941 with a practice strike against Pearl Harbor. Ernie King was a cantankerous old curmudgeon, but a genius with carriers. He followed his Pearl Harbor attack with a successful strike against Mare Island Navy Yard. In 1939, King's Carrier Division 1, the Saratoga and Lexington, was joined by the new Yorktown and Enterprise, making up Carrier Division 2 under Rear Admiral William F. Halsey. Together, Ernie King and Bill Halsey gave us a preview of how World War II was going to be fought. And so on the eve of that long-foreseen war with Japan, the planes, the carriers, the doctrine, and the great carrier commanders who'd lead us to ultimate victory were there.
Just as Billy Mitchell had predicted years earlier, in December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m., almost the 7:30 a.m. that Mitchell had predicted. The Navy's air carrier development in the intervening years had allowed the U.S. to provide a forward projection capability, and this resulted in the first attack on mainland Japan. In early 1942, carrier operations achieved success with the Doolittle raid, also known as the Tokyo raid, a sea-based U.S. air raid on 18 April 1942 on Tokyo and other places on the Japanese mainland. It was the first American air operation to strike the Japanese mainland. Although the raid caused comparatively minor damage, it demonstrated that the Japanese mainland was vulnerable to American air attacks and greatly increased U.S. morale. As always, thank you for watching.